How did this movie business begin? How did this, I don't want to say monster, but this global phenomenon that lasted at its peak for 50 years, how did it start? I like beginnings. I'm fascinated by nothing to something, rags to riches, all those stories. I just find them fascinating. So we have to go back before the movie picture business was invented, before the camera was invented, to a time in the middle of the 19th century, the century of science, the century of discovery, the century of the photograph, the phonograph, the telephone, the movie camera, the automobile, and by 1903, at the end of the 19th century, the airplane, the electrification of cities, and much, much more. So let's start at 1837. I was surprised that it was that early. I thought it was much later. But in 1837, a Frenchman by the name of Daguerre figured out a way to take an image through a lens, put it onto a negative, and then eventually had that negative printed. Now, this process, there's never just one person involved in inventions. There's other engineers or scientists from other countries succeeding and failing and coming close but not quite reaching it. So he wasn't the only person involved. But he definitely, for this very basic format, perfected a way for a camera to take a photograph. Now, of course, there have been portraits done for hundreds of years. Portrait painters, famous portrait painters would do a fantastic job of really representing their subjects. But this was now an image of a person on through the negative onto film, onto a screen, onto a piece of paper that had never been done before. So the origins of the photography business were all commercial. The cameras were too big, too expensive for individuals to use. So the professional photographers, photography houses, and they would sell their ability to make portraits to the public. Now this went on for 50 years, but we're going to stop a little sooner. Let's go up to the next benchmark, which would have been 1861. Now from 1861 to 1865, the US of A was involved in their Civil War. As Ken Burns has said, a very bloody affair. But what is, I think, amongst all the other things about the Civil War was this war was photographed from start to finish. Now, of course, photographs, again, were only static. There were no action pictures. The shutter speeds were such that whatever was being photographed had to be completely static, and sometimes for long periods of time. You couldn't move if it was you, or the scene would have been a landscape or something. So no action pictures, but photographs of soldiers standing on mountains of cannonballs, or standing on huge artillery pieces, or a group of soldiers, or portraits on portraits on portraits of these soldiers before they went into battle, maybe after they had survived the battle. And then there were battle scenes. There were soldiers on mountains where they had just finished a battle. There were images of destruction. And then, of course, the battlefields themselves. There were thousands upon thousands of pictures taken of the battlefields and of the soldiers who had fallen, demonstrating what a horrific, horrific war there is, if there isn't any war that isn't horrific. One of the main players in this photographing Olympics was a fellow by the name of Matthew Brady. Now, he didn't take all the pictures himself. He had a company, and there were many other photographers. But what he did was put on exhibitions near the end of the war, and then after 1865, where he basically put his pictures on display. And I can't help but think that the public was completely enraptured by these photographs, that they were so vivid. They showed an event that touched every single American and people around the world. And there were literally thousands of photographs. They had family photographs. They had historical photographs. And these photographs survived for a very long time, almost lost, but many of them were saved. So I have to think that this was another jolt in the photographic journey, that people really thought that photography was not only here to stay, of course, but also a very valid tool for documenting a period. So the war ended in 1865. Let's jump ahead now, almost 10 years. Now there was an ex-governor of California. His name was Stanford, and he was a businessman, and he owned racehorses. And I guess because he'd been around racehorses so much, he was of the belief that a horse, when it galloped, at some point in that gallop, all four hooves left the ground. Now, this isn't necessarily earth-shattering, but a lot of people didn't believe that. And I've read where paintings were made of horses when they were galloping and all. There was always at least one, if not two, hooves on the ground. And he said, no, that's not true. But he couldn't prove it. There's a rumor, of course, that he made a bet with his colleagues and compatriots, a very expensive bet, that he could prove it. Apparently there's no documentation to support that, but it's kind of fun if it is true. Anyhow, he commissioned a famous photographer at the time, a fellow by the name of Eadweard Muybridge, who had done a lot of work for the US government, who had done landscapes and scenes out west, places that maybe were disappearing, native tribes that might have been disappearing. But he also did a lot of photographs of animals, and he studied motion. So I guess somehow they met up in California. Stanford was aware of this fellow's work, and he said, I want you to take pictures of my horses and prove that I'm right. Well, the first go-around in the early 1870s, it didn't work out too well. The cameras just weren't up to the task of capturing a horse at full gallop to prove that this was a possibility. So it was blurry, or the camera, the shutter speeds, the technology, certainly Muybridge didn't have it. If it existed in the world, he didn't have that camera. Probably didn't have it anywhere. So they set about, he and his colleagues, to improve the cameras, to look at shutter speeds and whatever other technical aspects of photography that they could, to improve their ability to film, to take pictures of motion. So that by 1877, 1878, they think they had the camera. And what Muybridge did was he put 12 cameras on the side of the racetrack, all very close together, and he attached to the shutters a rod or a string or some device that extended out into the track. And then when the horse galloped past, the legs of the horse would hit these strings or rods, trigger the shutter, and a picture would be taken. So he could have 12 pictures taken in very rapid succession from 12 different cameras, simulating almost a motion picture camera. So they tried this, and lo and behold, it worked. They put the pictures together. There were 12 very famous photographs, and in one of those photographs, where the hooves of the horse, the legs, were not extended as they galloped, but were underneath the horse, one of the pictures showed that all four hooves were off the ground. So everybody's happy. I think it's a fun story because it shows that photographers, and maybe even the public, and certainly investors and people with money, were interested in motion photography. I think they couldn't have helped but looked at these photographs and say, well, isn't it a pity that we can't have a tool, a machine, a camera that could actually capture motion? So that was the late 1870s. Now, 10 years later, it all started to happen. In France, the Lumière brothers developed a camera that could take pictures of motion, moving pictures. In the United States, a fellow by the name of George Eastman developed a roll of film, a celluloid film that was put into a roll. And he invented a camera. You could put this roll of film in the camera, take pictures, and advance the film and take more pictures. This is a camera, not a motion picture camera, but a photographic camera. Eastman is a tremendously interesting character, and I wish I knew more about him. But he wanted a name for this camera, so he tried, I don't know how many thousands or hundreds or tens of thousands of words, but he wanted to come up with a name for this camera that would stick and that the public would immediately latch onto. And the word he came up with was Kodak. And Kodak reigned the photography business, like all these other things, for 100 years, maybe 75 years. Massive factories around the world, developing film, making cameras. The Kodak camera was a staple once it went to the public in thousands, if not millions, of households. So that's I just find that a tremendous story. So it didn't take long for the people who were trying to make motion picture cameras to realize that what Eastman had done with this roll of film could be adapted to what they were trying to build in a movie camera, such as Lumière did in France and Thomas Edison did in the United States. So Edison's patent involved putting holes in the film, the side of the film, sprockets, where a wheel could have spikes that would go through these holes and therefore control the speed of the film going across the lens. So he patented that, and that camera was the motion picture camera in the late 1880s, early 1890s. The Lumières also had their own camera. They had been working on it, and in 1895, the next most important year, the Lumières went the next logical step. You've got a camera, you capture motion on film, you've got this film, what do? Well, you've got to project this film. So their camera not only took the film, the camera also could project the film. And in 1895, there was a public screening of Lumiere's images. They just rented a room or a hall, and they put the images on the wall, and that was the first time motion pictures were shown in public, 1895. Now, around the same time in the US, Edison and his team, and he always had a very large team. If you know the name Nikola Tesla, that would tell you what kind of talent would be attracted to Edison and his work. So they had 8 or 9 companies that were all involved with making films, making the cameras, eventually working on projectors. Edison invented this thing called a kinetoscope, where you could pay a little money and look into this very ugly machine, and you could see the film one frame at a time, and it would roll through this kinetoscope, and so it would be like a motion picture, but only in the machine. So that's how we started out. After 1895, of course, the Lumière showed what it was really all about. So I had these 8 or 9 companies that were involved in all these processes, and they decided to protect their patents. This was a brand new industry. Almost everything they were making had to be patented because no one else was making it. And so they had to protect it such that people just wouldn't take their products and build their own. Initially, that sounded like a very reasonable idea. This became known as the Edison Trust. Now, what happened in the late 1890s and 1900s was they tried to control the entire motion picture business in the United States. They bought the houses where the movies were shown. They made the cameras. They made the film stock. They developed the film. They made movies that could only be shown in their film houses, and so people who owned them independently and wanted films had to use Edison movies. I can't help but think that if you look at the history, that this might have slowed the progress of movie making in the US, but not in Europe. France, Italy, and England were well advanced of the US in movie making. They had taken stage plays and put them onto film. They had started doing narratives with these stage plays. It was really well in advance of where the US was. And then in the next year, 1903, a fellow by the name of Edwin S. Porter made this very long movie, 12 minutes long, called The Great Train Robbery. And this was the first time in the US that a director had made a film, and using the film to cut it and put it back together and do all the things that films do now as a matter of course. He told the story of a train robbery. Now, most of the films in the US at this time were 2 minutes, 3 minutes long in this kinetoscope, or even if it was being shown in a movie house, they were very short. This one was a whopping 12 minutes, and it was an overnight success. Audiences went crazy. They loved it. They wanted more. And little by little, the European films started to come over to the US, and they were not 12 minutes long. They were 30 minutes, 60 minutes. In some places, they were 2 hours long. So the 1900s were a boom period for Europe and a modest growth for the United States. Now, at the time with this Edison Trust, there of course were independents coming from other places wanting to make movies. And the center of movie making at that time was New York State, New Jersey, around the factories that Edison had. And so these independents wanted to make their own movies, but Edison controlled everything, the trust. So they had to use Edison equipment. They had to use Edison movies. They had to put their movies into their playhouses if they bought independent playhouses. Well, these independents were an entrepreneurial lot. They were very spirited. They came from Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, but 7 or 8 of them all came from Eastern Europe, emigrated to the US as young men. And they were to be the builders of Hollywood. All Jewish men from various backgrounds in Europe, mostly impoverished, certainly not from wealthy families, but working Jewish families in Europe. And they came to the US. They worked as furriers, they worked as glove salesmen. They did whatever it took to survive, because of course the ugly face of racism is when they knocked on doors for work, they were turned away. So there are only so many doors you can knock on until you have to do the work yourselves. So they were entrepreneurial. They were very conscious of their customers. They had street smarts, and they knew that whatever their customers wanted or what they thought they wanted was what the product they wanted to give them. So naturally, these two groups came into conflict. Edison said to them, you know, you've got these movie houses and you're charging a nickel for people to watch these movies. Now, the beauty of these silent movies, and again, all these movies are silent for the next 15 years. No, that's not true. For the next 20 years, was that anybody could watch them. Now, think of all these cities in the U.S. at a time when immigration was exploding. Bring us your tired, bring us your cold, that inscription on the Statue of Liberty. They could watch these movies because if they didn't speak English, it didn't matter. And these independents charged a nickel for these people to come in. Well, Edison said a nickel's too cheap, you got to charge more. They said no. They said, you know what? Our audiences, our clientele, they're tired of these films you've been giving us. They're academic films. There's a little bit of narrative films, but they're very short, and the novelty's worn off. We want the ability to make our own films and to make better films, more narrative films like they're making in Europe. Edison said no. So there were clashes, and there were clashes such that the Edison Trust started out, I guess, I don't know who came first, hiring goons, gangsters, and thugs to go to find these independents that were making movies, destroy their cameras, maybe beat them up. I'm not sure if anybody was killed. The independents hired goons, gangsters, and thugs to protect their interests and to beat up the Edison Trust goons when they came to destroy their equipment. Well, again, everything was shot in a very small geographical area in upper eastern U.S., New York State, New Jersey. Well, this couldn't go on, obviously. So late in the 1907, 1908, 1909, the independents figured that the best way to not have to worry about the trust was to put distance between them. So they started out and they moved some crews to Florida. Well, that wasn't far enough. It wasn't that big a deal for the trust goons to go down to Florida from New York. So they decided to go west, young man. And a couple of film crews went west. They went to Arizona. Yeah, they have mixed results. They went to Nevada, I think, New Mexico. But of course, if you keep going west, you end up in California. Now, the other thing we have to realize at this time was that almost all movies were shot outdoors. Even if they had sets, they had no ceilings because they needed sunlight to shoot these pictures. The lights at the time were not sophisticated enough to properly light scenes so that they could shoot indoors. So they shot outdoors. Now, of course, they couldn't shoot if it was raining or snowing or if there was just inclement weather. That would stop production. And given how popular movies were becoming, even by 1908, 1909, 1910, they realized that they couldn't slow down for a second. They couldn't give the public enough movies fast enough. So they got to California. They tried a bunch of cities. They ended up in Los Angeles. Large labor supply. 350 days of sunshine. It probably hasn't changed to this day. And geographically, to the west of Los Angeles was an ocean. Good for filming. To the north, east, and south were mountains, snow-capped mountains, forests, flatlands, and desert. So California had everything on which to provide a backdrop for telling stories, for making movies. You could make movies about ancient Egypt 20 miles outside of Los Angeles. You could make movies about the Klondike going up into the hills. You could make movies about pretty much anything if you were stationed in Los Angeles. So So a couple of film groups got there around 1910 and looked around, and they found a town recently incorporated that was just outside the city limits of Los Angeles, easy to get to if you stayed in Los Angeles. This whole plot of land had been owned by a family from the Midwest. They bought some orchards, probably orange groves and other things, and decided to sell off large chunks of the land to whomever and try to control who bought. Like no heavy industry, no, I don't know, whatever else that they decided would be unseemly. Of course, there was no movie industry, so they couldn't veto a movie industry because the movie industry didn't exist. So the crews got there and they said, well, let's look at this place. What's it called? It's called Hollywood. So one of the crews rented a big barn and started shooting. And very quickly they realized that this location had everything. As I said, you go a few miles out, you're up in the mountains. A few miles this way, you got rolling hills and things for westerns and those kinds of movies. You go further east and you've got the desert. You go west and you've got ocean shots. So it really was an ideal situation. And even though some of Edison's Trust people managed to get out to California, it was a long way to go for diminishing returns. The independents got better and better at protecting their interests. And even though there were some gun battles and some great stories about what happened, they were pretty much safe from the Edison Trust. So that's 1910, 1911. The period from 1911 to 1914 is critical. More movies were being made. The independents had their own theaters. They had already made small fortunes. They were going to very soon make unbelievable fortunes. And there were, so Hollywood was a thing. And anybody who was interested in movies decided that that was the place to go. The same way if you want to act on the stage, Broadway would have been the magnet. If you wanted to act in movies or be a part of movies, Hollywood very quickly became the magnet. It grew so quickly. And the other thing was that with the labor, when there's problems with jobs, the movie industry was growing, so there was always work. It doesn't mean that they just walked onto lots. They had to line up in front of these companies and wait for it to be picked. But it happened because the silent pictures could employ thousands of extras, whether there was a few stars or 100 or thousands. Once you start to watch silent films, you can see how many people actually were on set for some of these films. It's just uncanny, and they were all people, not computer generated. So, as a magnet, it attracted first off a very influential director. He had been making like 80 movies a month, 2 or 3, 4 minutes apart, maybe 10 minutes each, but was a real innovator and basically was one of the first geniuses of the motion picture business. So by 1913, he had developed quite a reputation, and he was tired of making these short films, and he had seen European films. One that stands out is an Italian film called Cabiria, which was over 2 hours long. He was floored by it. And he said, I can do better than this, or at least that's what he wanted to do. His name was D.W. Griffith. He was a director. He had been an actor. I think all of them started as actors. He became a director, and he was working on a film at the time. And just before another cataclysmic event in the world, which affected the entire film industry as well. So that cataclysmic event was the Great War, or what we now know as the First World War. So aside from the fact that it was a catastrophe of the first order where millions of people died for no reason at all, that war devastated the countries of Italy, France, England to some extent, Germany. So their film industries completely collapsed by 1914. Now, the U.S., even though they got involved in the war a few years later, they were untouched by this. And there was still an enormous market for their pictures. So now there was no competition. Hollywood had the monopoly on movies. They couldn't make enough of them, they couldn't make them fast enough, and all the talent in the world that wanted to be involved in pictures would go to Hollywood, because until such time as the war was over, it ended in 1918, and very, very slowly the film industries of Germany, spectacularly, by the way, came back. France, for sure, England, and I suppose Italy, but I'm not sure how successful they were, because they very quickly in 1922, which was only 4 years after the war, they got a leader that really wasn't good for the entrepreneurial class and the making of anything. So by 1914, the world of Hollywood was exploding, and I'm sure that the people at the time, they just couldn't believe it. They were experimenting with films. They didn't know. Many of the interviews, if you watch them on these fabulous documentaries, they didn't really know what they were doing, but they were doing it. They were doing it quickly. They were doing it week in and week out. They were having a lot of fun, and they were making movies, and they were making a lot of money. So Griffith in 1914 finished a picture called Intolerance, and this was a 2-hour plus picture. It had thousands of extras. It was never been seen before in the U.S., like an American director in this kind of movie, never before seen. And they thought, well, this is it. This is going to change everything. But then, in 1915, he released another film. And this did change everything. Now, this, unfortunately, is a very controversial film. It's an example of how technology can be developed and innovative and new and fantastic, and yet the subject matter can be utterly destroying. So the film was initially called The Klansman, and then later it was called Birth of a Nation. D.W. Griffith was a Southerner. His father had fought in the Civil War. He had been born 10 years after the war had ended, and his father, his uncles and friends would, he said, sit around the house when he was a little boy and talk about the battles and all the fun or whatever they had. And so that was in his soul, and he wanted to make a movie about this, and he did. Now, the movie was as long or not longer than Intolerance, but it had more advanced techniques of storytelling, editing, some of the language of the movies that he had already worked on and almost perfected. The close-up, the extreme close-up, the cutting, the cliffhanger, all these things that were become standard issue in movies were really incredibly innovative, and all came together perfectly in this film. The problem is that the heroes of this film were the Ku Klux Klan. And so the result of this picture being so incredibly popular was that it allowed the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, especially in the Deep South. There was rioting, there was a lot of people were killed, a lot of protests. So I think the closest comparison that you could come with is some people say an incredibly successful, incredibly competent documentary called Triumph of the Will by a German director, a female director named Leni Riefenstahl, who in 1934-35 did a documentary on one of the Nazi Party rallies in Germany. And it is, if you ever get to see it, it is a brilliant film, except its subject matter. So anyways, this is 1915. The Hollywood was booming, but aside from Griffith, there were these companies that had come to Hollywood. Now, between 1915 and 1920, they would all be established, but all these independents that came there, beginning in 1911, they would set up shop, they would open their companies, and of course the money was absolutely pouring in. I imagine that their names are all lost to time, but not their companies, not most of them. Adolf Zucker, Carl Laemmle, Sam Goldwyn, Louis B. Mayer, Jack and Henry and Jack Warner, Sam Cohn. These people were those independents from Eastern Europe who came to America believing in the American dream, found that the doors to the motion picture business were open because it was so new, and they were savvy, street smart guys who knew how to give the public what they wanted, and they were great businessmen, and they created these companies, also known as studios, between 1915 and 1920. Oh, William Fox, I missed that one. William Fox. So the names, unless you're a movie fan, are probably unknown today, but even at the time, of course, the industry knew all these people, but even the movie-going public knew these people. They were kings in their kingdom. And there were a few princes, but mostly they were the kings and everybody else were the subjects. So, but the companies they made, many of the names are still around. Paramount, MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, always called MGM, Universal, Fox, 20th Century Fox, the Fox of today. Now, of course, over 50, 60 years, they've changed hands many times, but the names have remained. And these were the studios that were created in the 1915, and they made enormous amounts of money such that they could make pictures constantly 365 days a year. And they also were attracting the talent from around the world to come and be part of this, whether it was the jobs for ordinary laborers, extras, and all the other jobs that come with making movies, to directors, playwrights, and of course the other phenomenon of this period that lasted, I guess it lasted to this day, but at the time what the movies liked were stars. And between 1910 and 1916 there were stars. And remember, because the films were silent, the movies they made were shown all over the world. So these stars were better known than anyone else in the world, and there were four. D.W. Griffith, as I've mentioned, Douglas Fairbanks, a silent screen athletic action figure kind of a fellow. Mary Pickford, a very shy, reserved little thing, Canadian, I believe. And of course, perhaps the only star that still is memorable to most audiences, Charlie Chaplin. So these four people were the most well-known people in the world. Griffith up to a point, but certainly Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin. They were known throughout the world. They made fabulous amounts of money for their work. They made fantastic pictures. Once you acquire a palate, a taste for silent films, the pantomime cinema, you will be able to see what they did, especially Chaplin. And the audiences just couldn't get enough of them. So this all began in full force by 1915. The studios, in other words, the moguls, the stars, the money, the impact that films had on culture throughout the world, hairstyles, clothes, whatever they saw on the screen. Culturally, people would cut their hair that way. They would dress clothes. They would dress like the actors did, unless there were period pieces, of course. And it was the phenomenon that began and lasted with the same studios, the same heads of studios till the mid-50s. And even though the studio heads died off and finance became more of a controlling factor than these moguls who obviously wanted to make a lot of money, but also wanted to make pictures the way they wanted to make them, it was an amazing run. And so that was how the movies became so powerful. The industries of Europe caught up for a while, not caught up, but they were doing better in the 30s. There were lots of excellent films from Italy, France, England. But again, in 1939, there was another war. Certainly in Europe, a suppression of a collapse of the film industries there, but much less so in the US, although they also took it because many, many, many people involved in the film industry ended up serving. But 1915 is the benchmark. 1920 was the perfection of the system. The moguls, the studio heads, really had down what they were doing. There were actors and actresses and playwrights and everyone, cameramen, were flocking to Hollywood to make those pictures that I love to watch and I think are worth watching. At least that's how I see it from the 22nd row.